Good morning. It's a real pleasure to have you together as a group today to talk about the importance of storytelling in communicating travel and tourism. It's part, I think, of the experience of travel. We haven't done it very well in the past. We're getting better, and we've got some real experts on this panel to tell you how to do it better. But I also think it's really important to the process of engaging people in sustainability. We have to make it something that's interesting and something that people want to engage with. So Dawn, we're going to start with you. Dawn Lamonius, you're a storyteller, an author, and you're based in Montego Bay, which is, I think, fairly obvious from the screen behind you. Do you want to tell us how you see storytelling and why it matters to you and your community?
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. Harold, storytelling is a major part of our culture. And I know that all cultures have stories. But for us as Jamaicans, our stories can be very entertaining. And in delivering the stories, they can be very animated. We have, apart from our cultural folklore, folk tales, we have stories that surround attractions and places of interest as well. So the thing about stories is that they have a way of connecting. They have a way of helping people to see who you are, to understand who you are, and to understand how you think. And that, for me, that is storytelling.
It seems to me, John, that it's the stories that you generate between you as the visitor and the local community, and the stories you get told by the local community that gives your trip content and meaning. Because I'm sure that's a very beautiful place that's behind you there on the screen, but yes, there's lots of beautiful places just like that around the world. I'm sure that one's the best in the world, but there are lots of others. So what makes it different? The only thing it seems to me that can make it different is the storytelling and the engagement with local people in the destination. Is that what the community feels as well in Jamaica? Yes.
Let me just say that this is a picture that I personally took at Treasure Beach here in Jamaica on the South Coast. For us, storytelling means a lot. And, you know, in thinking about storytelling and tourism, it's dawned on me that we have so many attractions and places of interest in Jamaica that have actually been popular because of storytelling, because of a story. I can think, let me start up with our Indigenous people, the Maroons. The Maroons of Jamaica were former slaves of the Spanish, and when the British conquered the island, they ran away to the hills, and they led guerrilla warfare against the British for over 80 years until they signed the peace treaty. Now that community that I'm speaking specifically of is one of several other Maroon communities, but the one I'm speaking of is a compound town. And although the people live there, and that's their story, it became a pull. So people want to go to the community because they want to hear more about the stories, they want to see what they've heard about, and they want to feel.
Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Dawn. Elisa, one of the problems, it seems to me, is that certainly if you look at my society, we've pretty much lost the ability to tell stories. It's been professionalized. Authors do it. Some comedians do it very well. There are a few professional storytellers. But when I think back to the kinds of people I used to meet in pubs 20 or 30 years ago, they were great storytellers. They're not there anymore. How do we fill that gap, Elisa?
That is a great question. Thanks, Harold, and everyone on the panel. Be very happy to be here. How we fill the gap? The short answer to that is zooming in and create that space and that time, and to listen, first to connect, and then to listen to the story. So the way I see storytelling, I see like is an amazing tool because it goes in two directions. The first is that allow the authenticity of the cultural expression, the lifestyle and the history to reach in a more direct way the tourist. On the other side is an crucial, empowering tool. For the local community, of course, because what it does, it gives visibility to untold story and to story that need to be told, story about the indigenous, their connection with the land, their history, and also the natural environment that we don't know, or we need to know, we need to hear, but also it prepare that magic of the encounter that happened between the tourists and the locals. But even more importantly is a self-empowering process for the community. So every time that I meet a community member to tell their story with them, I have like 2 hours conversation on the Zoom. This time has been only. Through that process, so the process to telling their own story is a liberating process, is a self-empowering in the sense that they are able to look back at their own culture, in the first place as a community, to see what they are. So, oh, there are tourists that want to hear the story, they want to see it. So it means that my story is important. This is one aspect. The other aspect on a human level is when you are telling your own story, and I ask them to tell me about their childhood, and they stop and look at their own story. They look at what I've done as a cultural being and a social being, how the women have been empowered through all these activities I've done, the involvement, engagement. And so in that moment, I see them owning back their own story in a way that is, you can see visibly in their eyes, even through a Zoom. So this is really important, and we actually allow this connection. So allow these stories to come through. And that's why, so the travel marketing, unfortunately, has been partial for too long. So the narrative that we hear only come from one side, and coming from the foreigners most of the time. And this is what we have to switch. I'm not saying this perspective is not important. I think it is important to have another cultural being come into a place and tell us, either be these are a journalist or also a tourist, but also this is important to have a different perspective. At the same time, this is partial. We have to remember that the narratives has to be plural. The narrative of the destination are the people that live in that destination. So we have to create space for this community storytelling, as I call it, become more important, more relevant.
Dawn, can we just come back to you? Because I accept what Elisa is saying, and it's quite clear that there's a degree of cultural imperialism, quite a big degree of cultural imperialism in the way in which source markets, originating markets for tourism present places, particularly like Jamaica, frankly. Yeah, people have a particular view of Jamaica, which I've never been there, but my guess is it's a very partial and incorrect view. And I imagine that Jamaica is complicated and diverse like every other place I've ever been. I've no reason to think it isn't like that. And yet we get sold a kind of picture postcard image of Jamaica with beaches and a particular kind of music and a particular kind of food. I suspect Jamaica is more complicated than that. Is that fair? And do your communities get a sense of empowerment when they get to control the story?
Yes, we are diverse, we are unique, and because of our history, and that is what makes us so unique. Because you know, the Tainos were here, the American Indians, the Amerindians, the Africans came, the Spanish came, the British came, the Germans came, the Palestinians came, the Jews came. All of those persons claim Jamaican nationality because they're all Jamaicans. That is what makes us so unique. So it is not really, for us, it's not really complicated. It is just a weave, a beautiful, you know, mastery of colors and ethnic groups that have made us who we are. Now, the communities, I think, have accepted their history, the Maroons especially. There has been a move towards what we call community tourism in Jamaica, where the community identifies its uniqueness, its story, and sells the story among other experiences. For example, I have been to a compound town because of the story. And when I go there, when I was going there, I was expecting to see any evidence of cudgel, who signed the peace treaty. I wanted to see what the peace treaty consisted of. Anything that is there that I'm not familiar with. And I did see that herbalism and that kind of thing. So yes, and that is just one of several other communities, because we have also, in addition to the Maroon community, we have a German community. These Germans who came here after emancipation and settled in rural Jamaica. And so it is not uncommon to go to Seaford Town in Westmoreland and see Caucasian people there who are Jamaicans, who speak perfect Jamaican English as well as dialect. And it has become a pull as well. People want to know how these Germans were transported, you know, from Germany to Jamaica and settled in. What is it that brought them there? There's a story to it. There's a story to Port Royal being dubbed the wickedest city on earth at one stage. And of course, the earthquake of 1692 destroyed a haven for pirates and drunkenness and recklessness that prevailed during this period. And also the fact that in 1907, there was another earthquake that tilted a storehouse and that gave us what is called the Giddy House. People want to go to Port Royal to experience the Giddy House. They want to see where Henry Morgan, that great Welsh pirate who was governor of Jamaica at one stage, you know.
Dawn, I wonder, it's great to hear about that diversity, and I'm not surprised that it's there. I mean, that's been my experience in most places in the world. But I suspect that most people getting off the plane when they arrive in Jamaica for a holiday know nothing of that. And therefore, there's still a problem, isn't there, about how that diversity is communicated internationally, particularly, but also possibly domestically, so that people appreciate it. But let's accept that storytelling enables the empowerment of those communities. But it seems to me this, and I think we could probably take that as read. It's clearly very important that we hear from those communities about their history and about the way in which they understand their position in the world, rather than what some college-educated travel itinerary producer based in New York or London chooses to say about the place. The place belongs to the people who live there, in my view.
Yes.
So let's accept that as read and see where we go from there. Because it seems to me then there are two issues, Elisa, if I just come back to you briefly, and I'm going to come to Joanna. One of them is, do people have the skills to be able to tell those stories? Now, in Jamaica, I imagine there is still a very strong oral tradition, and parents tell stories to their children. In my community, people do tell stories to their children, but they read them out of a book. They don't create their own stories, and they don't pass on stories that they've heard from their parents or from their history. And I think back on my childhood, there was nothing of that in my upbringing, and I'm nearly 70, so the situation will be worse now. So Elisa, where there is no culture of organic storytelling, what do we do?
Okay, so about the skills, there are two things, because when we talk about storytelling, every community has storytelling. Everyone, they are storytellers, because even especially the one they have no writing tradition, their tradition is oral. You know, this is actually the very, clear example that their story is being passed on orally. And that's why in the community-based tourism project, it's so important the moment when they sit in a circle with a tourist. They do this already, they do this. Now, it's true that the community are different. We can't talk about the community everywhere in the world. They're not the same. They pass through different kind of cultural alienation, and new generation also suffer from this. So is taking, starting from the point that this is a complex, matter. But yes, first of all, they already are storytellers. But it comes from the point when they think about travel marketing, they think, oh, we don't have the skills. When I do the community storytelling workshop with them to enable them to tell their own story, the first thing I say to them, you already have a story. You already are a storyteller. because what does it mean be a storyteller? Doesn't mean having a degree in journalism or having a degree in English literature or other skills. Is more about passing the idea that they already have their skills. They can communicate a story with a poem, with a dance, with a video, with a picture. The way they can use consciously storytelling as a marketing tool, this is what I'm actually saying, to directly connect with the tourist, is a way that they can already do it. Of course, there are something they can learn, but it's not reinventing the wheel, because the content they are the being with the story. So it's more like switching the perspective and changing the paradigm in a way. We don't need to be a journalist to tell a story, and the community are already the one that can tell the story in the way they want to tell it, through it with a picture, as I say. So it is more about don't become too technical about what we need to be a storyteller, rather than what is the content, because what is more important is the story. So giving space, and I'm talking here, giving, to the travel media, why don't create more space to share the stories? Because the way they can be told are different. And I don't know if I answer your question, but I'm happy to get deep in one of these points, but I don't want to take more time.
Let me turn this to Joanna, because let's talk about the many communities who have lost their oral tradition. There are many communities who no longer have that oral storytelling tradition. What do we do? Do we decide that they're never going to be able to tell stories, or do we try to enable them to tell stories?
Well, I think that there are a couple things at play here, and one of them is to keep in mind is that there is the overarching tourism story that we need to think about as well. And somebody earlier mentioned this dominant narrative that we have in the tourism space, and that dominant narrative that we have been leaning on is largely sanitized and comfortable for wealthy Western white travelers. And so this is the story that has held up the kind of tourism model that we've been working under for generations. But I think that dismantling the
carry on.
model of tourism that has enabled to so I think that if we continue to lean into this destructive narrative that has upheld kind of tourism that has not empowered local communities, we are going to continue to having problems with the way that we conduct tourism as a whole. So I think we need to be looking at the model of tourism from the top. We need to break down the way that we offer the tourism product. And when we do that, and when we deliver from the bottom up versus the top down, focusing from the community first, they are the ones that determine how a travel experience is delivered, how the story is integrated into that experience, and whether that is through their traditional dances or spoken word or whatever that might be. Like Eliza said, it doesn't have to be written word or something that might come to mind when we think of what storytelling looks like. The important thing is that that story is driven from the community, regardless of what that looks like. And when we look at the model of tourism that we're working in, we can't look at storytelling and tourism. Storytelling has to be integrated into the way we deliver the travel experience. And I think by doing that, by giving agency to people and communities, they are the ones who decide how that story is told. If that story is told, who tells that story? And so I don't think we need to teach anybody how to tell their story. We need to give them space. We need to give them platforms. We need to give people we need to make travelers aware that the travel experience isn't all about them. We need to make them aware that they bring a certain perspective and bias to the travel experience that might taint the way they expect a story to be delivered. And we need to turn that on its head, because the stories that we're telling right now are not, they're not helping the communities that we work in. And I know, Harold, you had mentioned that you have seen some promising shifts in the tourism industry as of late in regard to storytelling. And I think that's because for far too long, we haven't given attention to the importance of the way that we talk about travel and the people who are telling the stories in the places where people are visiting.
I think the problem with travel and tourism, Joanna, is not that there haven't been stories. It has been about who's telling the story. But the consequence of those stories being told about Jamaica from London, or about India from New York, the problem with that is that the dominant storytellers are not in the communities who are being visited. Now, some communities still have strong traditions of storytelling, and that was why I was so pleased, Dawn, that you agreed to join the panel, because it seems to me that is the case in Jamaica. But there are lots of other communities where the storytelling tradition has largely died out within the community itself, and where the history that people have of their own place is actually one which they've got from outside. It isn't their own. You look at in India at the way in which contemporary authors in India are rewriting the history of India through novels and various other means of storytelling. That's clearly going on. And my question, in a way, to you, Joanna and Elisa, is how do we support that? Because it's you know, we've got as far as saying we need to hear from communities, but how do we, let's take that as read now. It's not worth discussing. We've agreed that in the group. The question is, how do we actually make that happen? I can see how it can be done quite easily, Dawn, in Jamaica, because you've got those strong traditions, you've got the music and the poetry in Jamaica, you've got lots of it. But there are lots of other communities who haven't got those cultural traditions. They probably had them, but they withered, as they have in my own community. So I'm speaking, as it were, I suppose, from Faversham, hoping that somebody can solve this problem for me. How do we solve this? How do we empower communities? We agree we want to empower them, but they need to be able to tell the stories.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to go on?
Sorry, Elisa first.
No, go on.
Elisa first.
Okay, thanks. So as I was mentioning before, I think is all about creating space in the travel media. Simply at the bottom is creating space to, because now community are already telling the story, even it just is only in the experience. Okay, well, I know a lot of local community tour guides, and I have mentioned a lot of people there, while doing their own, teaching the others to do their own art, they are telling the story of their ancestor, etc. Now, why these stories are not reaching the tourists until they have experience? Because there is no space on a travel market, travel media. Now, it's responsibility of tour operators, and when they describe, when they create, they would describe the experience that are co-designed, designed by the community, or they design with the community. It depends on the case, because there are a lot of different experiences. Jamie also can confirm. All these experiences should be communicated in the way the local community are living experience and what they represent for them. So this is like a reshifting. Is not a tour operator calling their own team or marketing team and say, well, describe this experience. Is more involved with the community in the process of marketing and creating, describing simply what's happening when the tourists arrive. Because this, I conclude here, this is really important, because this moment of preparation of the encounter that the tourists will have there, if we not give space to preparation, a lot of cultural clash will happen, a lot of expectation will happen. So this will help to see the story beforehand, help more tourists to connect to this community and decide to go and visit them. And also when they're there, their mind will be blank in terms of, I'm not having expectation from my cultural perspective of what I'm going to go to see in Jamaica, because that story will help me to do that process of understanding them.
Elisa, we've established that there needs to be more space for these communities' stories to be told. I'm still concerned, Joanna, about how we generate those stories and how we make sure that they are presented by the communities in ways that capture people. And that doesn't necessarily mean professionalizing them, but it does mean that those skills need to be practiced.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, there's a lot of conversation given to this idea of the authentic experience that travelers want to have. And presumably when a traveler is seeking authenticity, they're seeking that, you know, that kind of space where they are having these conversations, hearing these stories or whatever. But we need to be intentional in what we're saying. And we need to, I agree with Elisa that we need to offer some guidance if needed to these communities on how to share those stories. We need people to recognize the opportunities to pick up on threads where they can take a story one step further. Because it might not be intuitive to folks who are not dealing with travelers all the time on how to share their stories. And so I think there needs to be, I don't want to say training, but like awareness of what a traveler might ask, what a traveler might be looking for, what they might be interested in, and understanding how to take advantage of those moments in order to share a little bit more than what the traveler might be expecting from their, you know, their preconceived notion of what this story might be. So I do think there's a certain amount of intentionality that needs to go into that. I think that travelers need to be aware that there are power dynamics at play, because, you know, we talk a lot about communities telling their own stories and people telling their own stories, but you know what, just as important is the right not to tell a story. And so I think there needs to be an emphasis on that as well. It needs to be okay for somebody not to share something. And so there is a certain amount of sensitivity training that we need to do with travelers. There's a certain amount of reframing of expectations that travelers need to have when they enter a space. And then there is also helping the people who travelers are encountering understand when they might be able to take a conversation a little bit further, when they can dig into those ugly, uncomfortable, controversial subjects that we are so keen to ignore and turn our back on in tourism. We need people to know it's okay to talk about those things. We need people to know it's okay to ask the hard questions. And it needs to be okay for people to say, I'm not comfortable talking about that at all. And that should, you know,
Sure.
People in communities need to have that space as well.
Carol, can I come to you? Thanks very much, Joanna. Carol, you to some extent sit between these two worlds. And I'm sick to death, frankly, of reading about how I'm going to be offered an authentic travel experience. I've no idea what it means, and I don't think the people using those words know what it means either. How do you see it in terms of marketing, particularly the Caribbean? And you, in a way, you've got it easy. Well, you ought to have it easy in the Caribbean, because clearly has very strong oral traditions, has very strong storytelling traditions. It ought to be easier in the Caribbean, certainly than it is in Britain or probably America. And yet, what do you see as the barriers? It was your idea that we should have this panel.
Thank you so much. Do you know what I see the biggest barrier is? And that really is exposure and experience. I've always said that a lot of the people who provide the services in the tourism industry haven't actually traveled themselves or traveled very far afield. Many people who work in hotels have not stayed in hotels. Those who are a part of storytelling do not always appreciate the story for themselves. And if you do not appreciate it for yourself and see the value and the worth in it, it's very difficult and challenging to be the messenger. So I think it's incredibly important in tourism communities, whether it's in Africa, whether it's the Caribbean, whether it's the Pacific, it doesn't matter where it is. But first of all, for people, and this starts from in the school, is in the classroom, to recognize who they are and the story that they have to tell. And for me, storytelling, and Joanna touched upon this, is not only about the oral. It's not even about the written. To me, storytelling isn't about the experience. I was born in England of Jamaican parents, didn't actually leave England until I was 18 years old. And all I ever heard about Jamaica was the stories that my parents told me as a child to frighten me. And they're always telling me about duppies. So the first time I got to Jamaica, I was well afraid of duppies. But what they didn't tell me, a little black girl growing up in England, was that in this island of Jamaica, there were people, black people, who were lawyers, doctors, teachers, the prime ministers, the governor general. So that opened my whole understanding of storytelling and the narrative and the experience that I had in Jamaica, not the stories that I hold, but how I actually experienced this led me to change my career, my potential career path from law to tourism. Because what I experienced in my first visit at 18 years old changed my life completely and made me realize that there was a whole world out there different from my life that I had in England that I could explore. And it caused me, and I laughed that the first article that I wrote at 18 years old for the company newspaper that I was with was then a blog. But of course, we didn't call it blog in those days. But I spoke all about my experience in Jamaica and the storms and how I linked this to a movie that I'd seen as a child called A High Wind in Jamaica. It opened up so much for me. So when you're talking about storytelling, you've got to start with the storytellers. And you've got to be sure that they recognize their story, they respect it, they understood it. One of my cousins, he did our family history for us. And I was so proud when I found out that my ancestors, many of them were Maroons and were a part of those who fought for the freedom of people in Jamaica. Meant so much to me and totally opened up my whole heart to my heritage, my roots, my culture. So when I speak about Jamaica, I can proudly talk about the fact that yes, I am the descendants of enslaved people, but I am also the descendants of those who fought for their freedom because they thought it was a fair thing to do. So storytelling to me is about the experience, and it's working with those who deliver the experience. And in working with them, I always say, we've got to prepare them to go to market. When someone has, let's just say, a Jamaican dessert, we have many different pastries in Jamaica, and you have people who can bake them well, but they don't know how to take them to market. They don't know how to talk about the stories, even the story of, let's say, for example, jerk meats. The origin of jerk, and Dawn knows this even better than me, is the fact that this meat was originally cooked underground so that if slaves were running away, the smoke would not draw attention to them. So now we'll go to festivals and parties and we enjoy jerk meats and jerk fish and jerk vegetables, but we don't know that the stories are part of the freedom, the emancipation. So again, I say, those who are telling the stories, we need to work with them so they have pride, they know the history. And I'm going to go back to authenticity. My daughter is a millennial, graduated with an arts degree, but she loves to travel. So whenever she goes on a tour, not because she's a millennial, you can't give her the Disney version or the fictional version. I say that with no disrespect to Disney, I've been there many times, but she wants the real story. She'll go into a great house, she'll look at the furniture, and she'll say, and she'll get on her phone, she'll check Google, does that piece actually reflect the origin, the story? We're dealing with smarter consumers. They have technology at their fingertips wherever they are, and therefore they can check the truth in what we're saying. So if we train those who tell the story and we're mindful that we have educated, aware, woke travelers, we're going to have greater synergy, greater respect, and greater sustainability for those telling the story.
So before I come to Jamie and we have a go at the tour operators, which I'm sure we will, Jamie, let's just talk about the intermediary role that you play in terms of marketing the Caribbean, Carol.
Yes.
What are the constraints that stop you putting some of these stories onto your website?
Do you know what? That's a really good point. And I think part of that is that every destination in the Caribbean has its own websites, its own channels, etc. And I think we rely on each destination to tell their story. Now, what we can do is to pull more on those stories and to share it from a more regional perspective. And you know what? It's not only storytelling. One of the biggest challenges I've always said is even with imagery. I'm always saying, why do we struggle to have images? I have journalists calling me all the time saying, Carol, we're doing a story, a feature. We need a picture that hasn't been shown 500 times. And then I say, why is it such a challenge to find images?
There's nothing to see in the Caribbean, Carol.
Well, we need to stop treating it like a secret and really get the images out there. And it also ties into a lot more of what Elisa said as well. We do have to work a lot more with the journalists, with the influence. In other words, we have a massive army of people out there wanting to tell the story, and we're not utilizing all the different players out there who can help us to tell the story. And a lot of it starts with the work that we ourselves do in the Caribbean, with our images, with our storytellers, with the communication channels that we use. There's a massive gap, and we do need to take advantage. And we need to understand people do want to hear our story as well. So we shouldn't keep it as a secret.
We need to push for differentiation in terms of the way countries are marketed. It frustrates me to hell and back when I hear people say, I'm going to America on holiday.
Yeah.
You can't go to America on holiday.
So
you can't
true.
do Europe on holiday either. I mean, the idea that you've been to one Caribbean island and you know the Caribbean, these things are absurdities, and we know that, but we still sell it that way. We're the people in the travel and tourism industry who create those ideas that the Caribbean is one place.
I certainly don't, but I know a lot of people do. I mean, that's why I'm always pushing the diversity of the Caribbean in terms of French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the English, take it down, the African, the European, the Middle Eastern. But you're right, we have to tell it. Those of us know, but there's so many who don't. And we have that story to tell even further.
I think part of it is about empowering those storytellers from the different communities across the Caribbean, both on particular Caribbean islands, but also across them. I mean, one of the most memorable experiences for me was the Garifuna when I visited Belize, and the Garifuna are in more than one place. I mean, I could be quite interested in a tour that took me to meet the Garifuna on different islands, for example. I mean, I just think we're not very good at creating these authentic experiences. But Jamie, I said we'd leave you until last, and inevitably you're from Planetera, so to some extent you are going to have to carry the can for the tour operators. But how do you see it from Planetera? I mean, you're one of the more progressive tour operators in the way in which you try to organize travel. Is it easy for you to find people who can tell the authentic stories, or is that a challenge as well? I'm taking it as read that you want to, and I think that's reasonable. Let's assume that that's the case. So what are the practical difficulties in actually putting these trips together with authentic local storytellers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you sound rather worried and concerned, Harold, about the future. And I think, a couple of things just to start with. I think everybody on the panel will likely agree with me that, the vast majority of travel that's been sold in the last 50 or 60 years has been all around, that you can have the creature comforts of home when you go to more and more exotic places. And I think all of us would likely agree, well, if you just want the comfort creatures of home, maybe you should just stay home. I think there's been increasing concerns about the vertical integration of the industry over the last few decades, and the lack of interest of these big corporations to actually sell the actual destination. They're selling more the amenities, it seems, than the actual people and places that you're going to visit. And so that had me concerned for a while. I understand your point about, certain cultures losing their storytelling community abilities, but at Planet Terra, we're actively working to support over 700 different communities in more than 70 countries now. And our focus has been on training and capacity building to enable communities to effectively tell their story their way. And we actually start not with the stories themselves, but we start with purpose. Why is it that these communities want to host travelers in the first place? What is the purpose of them using tourism? What do they want to use it for? And once we've been able to help them identify what their unique purpose is of why they're running community enterprises, then we can move on to the nature, the culture, the history, the traditions, and things like that. I think one thing, a caveat that I will say that we've noticed with our work over particularly the last 7 or 8 years, is we try to focus on the telling of the collective story and not the individual story. In way too many circumstances, we've found that it can be, sometimes traumatic and even exploitative in certain situations for people to be expected to tell their own individual story. I mean, I'll give, we work with people who were, formerly trafficked humans or are, victims of the sex trade. You can't have individuals telling their story every day to a traveler. That's triggering. That's just it's just actually completely a no-go. So there is, as Joanna said, there's some work that needs to be done to work with the tourist to understand when it's appropriate to ask what questions, but also for them not to be nervous. They're on holiday. It shouldn't be. We've got countless experiences of people who come from a marginalized and somewhat, from our perspective, a tragic past, who have now, found this ability to make their own livelihood through travel. I think another key focus of ours, Harold, has been the in-person storytelling. A lot of what we've been focusing here is how do you get the stories out from the communities into the living rooms and the bedrooms of the source travelers. We start first and foremost with the in-person experience, how to build a tourism experience that has its own narrative. There's a certain stagecraft to this. There is a certain skill set that needs to be developed. I couldn't agree with Carol more about, really helping these communities to understand, if you're a small Indigenous community in the middle of the rainforest in name the country, I'll pick Ecuador, then, you've got no idea. Why is somebody traveling 6,000 miles across the world to come and visit my community? They don't get it. So there has to be some work done for them to really understand and appreciate that people are now fascinated to understand. And I think maybe going to what you're saying, Harold, about the concern of many countries. You mentioned England. I think there's many, many more who are losing their oral traditions and their storytelling traditions. I think what comes with that is they're losing their sense of community. So there's therefore a need, a primal need in us as people to fill that somehow. And you can now fill that if you can't find it on your own doorstep. And I would argue you probably can. You just need to build that community yourself. But you can find it in travel through traditional communities. And our job is to help those communities to be able to build that kind of interactive experience that works both and is both meaningful, empowering, both for the host and the guest. That is essential. Let me give you one practical example. We work with a charity in Delhi in India called the Salambalik Trust. And they have developed something called the City Walk. And it is, Salambalik Trust has been around for 20 plus years. They're an amazing small NGO that works on the homelessness problem in India, which is, Google it. It's a massive challenge. what they have done is understand that once they're getting these children that they provide education and lodging for, that when they graduate them, when they get to 17, 18 years old, they need life skills. So they created this city walk as a hospitality training program. So you get to go on a walk around downtown Delhi. You go and see the typical sites, the big railway station and a number of other plots. But you also see it, they're able to tell and empowered to tell this collective story of homelessness in India and how it's still a very real problem, but that how through this program they have hope and they are able to make a difference. And I think, it's so great because not only do those individuals get paid, they get skills, they get to learn English, they get confidence, but also a significant amount of money goes back to actually funding the charity itself. And, I just challenge anyone to go and look at Salam Balik Trust, look at the website and just go and look at some of the testimonials that are there from people that used to be tour guides back in 2005, 2006. There's stories of people who got scholarships to go to university in the UK or the US, and it fundamentally changed their lives, and they've gone back and they're government employees, they're working. One guy's a senior manager in the train station that he actually was homeless in, and I think that is just a wonderful way of them being able to empower themselves to tell their story, and something that they've been brought up to believe was a shameful experience, to actually have pride in the fact that they've lifted themselves up through a little bit of a help up from this charity, to be able to be tell their story their way, and change the trajectory of their livelihood.
But Jamie, you're describing the activities of a travel company that's taken the issue seriously and done what it can to help that process along. And you talked about training and so on. There are very, very few travel companies doing that, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really why we've really made Planetera into an independent organization now to work with any travel company. We're actively talking with cruise companies. My background, Harold. I used to work in cruise, and I think what we're trying to do with the helps of everybody on this panel, let's be honest, is try to redefine what quality tourism should look like, and not make it as scary for mainstream tourism to be able to access community tourism experiences. You might arrive in a place on a cruise ship, or you may be staying in an all-inclusive resort, but that doesn't mean you can't go and experience these kinds of things that tour, packages and offerings that are offered by communities, and hear their stories from them, not through third parties and not through brochures.
Thanks, Jamie. Look, we're coming towards the end of this. I think what I'd like to suggest is we just go around for a quick 1 minute from each of you to say anything which you feel hasn't been said. But I'd quite like to provoke that by suggesting that, particularly what Jamie has said, makes it clear that some effort is required to level the playing field between the host and guest, and that actually finding ways of supporting the host community, and necessarily individuals in that host community, to tell stories on their terms is fundamental to making this work. And I think, Jamie, that's what I've heard you saying is happening from Planetera. But I'm going to give you the last word. So I'm going to start with Dawn, and we'll go around in the same order. Dawn.
Okay, thank you very much, Harold. I've been listening to, everybody's contribution, and I've been thinking so many thoughts going on. First thing is that in Jamaica, we have every primary school student, or going right up to tertiary level, and even some workplaces, we have a day in the month, which we call Jamaica Day. So we are very, very cultural, that kind of way. Jamaica Day, we will feature Jamaican culture, our music, our stories, our riddles, and so on. And so there's an awareness from childhood about our culture. And the government has gone further to have competitions where students sing, they dance, they do traditional dances, they do storytelling, they do poems in the dialect. That has created an awareness. The government has gone further to train tourism workers. All tourism workers must do a program called the Team Jamaica program, which exposes them to the culture or food or music or dance.
Dawn, that's a great example. I need to keep my eye on the clock and to let the others in. So that's a really great example of what governments can do. Elisa, what would you say?
Right, I will say, first of all, we have to listen, yes, to when the local community, they telling the story. The first and most amazing discovery for them is like, okay, I can choose my tourist. These change the perspective. So the first thing that I will realize is, so we're not just receiving tourists, we choose which kind of tourists we want here. And this is something that has to go through this marketing gap that we have to, that's why I'm saying the tour operator work with communities, and they have to start from asking questions. So who do you want, what do you want? As Jeremy was saying, of course, the purpose is all that about switching the priority and the perspective, right? So, and as well, travel market should make space on the marketing, on the magazine to tell the local stories. It's not just as a marketing space, yes, but it's more becoming for the tourists see this as a normal. So getting the stories this becoming a new normal, right? Not from getting the story, not from the journalist only, but also from the community. So I think we have to, and we do as a journalists, travel writers, and part of the tourism professional, we have to educate the tourists to expect something different. So this education starts in different ways. So I would say
the travel media are clearly very important in this, Elisa. Joanna, can we come to you? 2 minutes.
Yep, I just want to say that we have a tendency to talk about sustainable tourism in the context of tourism being sustainable, but I really think we need to reframe our way of thinking. The goal should be for communities to be sustainable and regenerative, for communities to be safe, equitable places where people can thrive, where the environment flourishes, and tourism can support those communities in being sustainable. Tourism in this way is a vehicle, it's a tool, and that's how we can create a more sustainable future for tourism, by supporting communities, guided by communities where tourism is something that holds up these communities, their story. They don't need to be molded by tourism. Tourism just needs to be used as a vehicle to help give agency to and share those stories with the wider world. So I think we need a different frame of reference. Instead of thinking about sustainable tourism, we need to think about how tourism can be used to support sustainability in the community so that they can continue to be their very best selves.
Thanks, Joanna. Carol.
Yeah, do you know what? This has been a really good reflection. And something that has come to me is that I've seen so many community people disappointed with tourism. And the reason why they're so disappointed is that we go to them and we tell them that their dance, their food, their products, whatever they have is so wonderful and the whole world wants it. But they don't know how to prepare it for market. Because at the end of the day, tourism is a business and there's a commercial side to it. And while we don't want to commercialize the authentic side of tourism, we do want to ensure that when we tell people that what they have is so desirable and it has such a wonderful story behind it, that we actually help them to deliver it. If we don't, they will continue to be disappointed. What's always heartbreaking for me is when I go to some of the large trade shows and I go around and I see local people, Indigenous people on that stand with some of the most beautiful art and craft, but because they haven't been told or trained or developed or helped and how to tell their story, people walk past and they sit there faces down, saddened because they were told it was a wonderful opportunity for them. So we've got to help with capacity building. We've got to help people to understand the value chain of tourism, and even they, as a person with their experience, how they fit into this model. People have to find their place. When they find their place, they find their purpose, and then it all slowly starts to come together for them, and they understand what all of their work and their effort is really about.
Carol, you've beautifully introduced what I assume Jamie is going to want to say.
Yeah, I mean, very practically, I'll just say if you run a community tourism experience or know of somebody that does, or you're wanting to, go to communitytourism.org and join the Global Community Tourism Network to get free access to capacity building and support and a network of other people. You're not alone. On a more aspirational level, Harold, I'll say, you know, we've set a target of getting $1 billion of revenue to community tourism enterprises by 2030. If you put that in the context of our 2019 tourism figures of international tourism being an $8.3 trillion industry, still all we're asking for is crumbs off the table. It's kind of pathetic. We should be getting a lot more than $1 billion, but we're saying let's start with $1 billion, and we need the help of big business to do that. They need to be listening to what these communities want, what they need. What Joanna said, it's all about uplifting communities, not necessarily uplifting tourism.
Yeah, I mean, my final thought as we come to the end of this is that it's about creating some degree of equality between the host and the guest, which is what the language implies. But actually, in the way it's used in travel and tourism, it's far from actually realizing any kind of basic equality between the visitor and the host. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm afraid we have now run out of time, but thanks very much indeed for being part of this. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'm sure we've given some cause for thought to people who will see this at WTM.
Thank you.